This is news? Donald Trump, a man who received 2.5 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, is the president? That doesn't seem right. Hold on. What? All right. He thought his last name was Apple? Okay, well, so apparently something went very wrong with the last election. It's as if the majority wishes of the American people was circumvented by a seemingly antiquated system that many are losing faith in. It makes sense why a great deal of the 2020 candidates are adding drastic election reform to their loose campaign promises, teasing the notion of considering, perhaps thinking about a chance of eliminating the Electoral College altogether, maybe if there's time. But before we maybe possibly take a sledgehammer to the foundation of our current system, let's curiously finger at its stony crevices to discover what exactly is the dilly with this Electoral College. Yes, let's finger it and find the dilly. Now, just as a refresher, none of us are technically voting for a presidential candidate on election day, but rather a group of electors in your state who, in most cases, have been designated by each candidate's political party. The number of electors per state match with the number of congresspeople, one for each member in the House of Representatives and two for the senators. Since bigger states have more representatives, they also have more electors, the grand total being 538 across the US of A. Bigger states have more resources, so it's a lot like that movie where all the cities are fighting, Mortal Engines, because it's really boring and terrible to think about. Most states also have a winner-takes-all system where every elector counts toward whoever won the majority, meaning that candidates simply have to focus on appealing toward most of the people in each state in order to reach the 270 votes required to become president. And this is how someone like Trump can lose the popular vote. Because if enough of the majority is either spread out or crammed into single districts, their votes can count much less than they should. The electoral map is a mosaic with only two colors. It doesn't always capture nuance, and every so often will misrepresent the wishes of Americans. And if you're curious why we have the system at all, aside from being a way to uphold slavery, well, statistically speaking, it works more than it doesn't. Out of all the elections we've had, there have been only 5 cases of a president winning without getting the popular vote. That's about an 8.5% failure rate. It only feels much worse because of, these two guys. The second reason is that the EC prevents candidates from focusing their campaigns on heavily populated areas while leaving rural America holding their respective genitals. Traditionally, that has been the reason we've kept the Electoral College, and it's not a bad reason. But the thing is, the internet has most likely changed the way elections work. The country is smaller, and information gets around faster despite where the candidates are physically campaigning. As we learned in 2016, social media is equally, if not more effective in terms of reaching voters, especially if you have a whole other country chipping in for you. But the thing about that thing is, there are still issues like agriculture and coal mining and crime that affect certain regional areas more than others. So it is important we have a system that doesn't favor one geographical area more than another. Completely destroying the Electoral College will just create an entirely new imbalance that could possibly be worse than what we have now. It's complicated and boring. Like the movie Mortal Engines, which I have not seen. Still, it stands to reason that the Electoral College is outdated and at least needs a tune-up. Unfortunately, just fixing it isn't that easy either. For example, one seemingly obvious solution is to have each state abolish the winner-take-all rule, and instead have each of their electoral votes reflect the percentage of the population voting for each candidate. So if a state had 10 electoral votes, and 60% of the state voted for candidate A, then they would get 6 of those votes, which is crazy, because in this scenario, candidate A stands for Adam Baldwin. And I liked Firefly too, but how could you all vote for that maniac? You should be ashamed. Anyway, there's nothing stopping states from using this percentage model. It's called the Congressional District Method, and in fact, both Maine and Nebraska vote based on this system. Only, well, here's the thing. According to multiple studies, while it would have come closer in results, this system still would have cost both Gore and Hillary Clinton the elections. It doesn't fix the popular vote issue, which would only be solved if we did away with the Electoral College completely. But again, that would create entirely new problems, because again, it's complicated and kind of boring, and extremely important to our democracy. But also, fixing the Electoral College isn't actually the most important concern when it comes to elections. I know it seems real bad right now, but honestly, there's a whole other branch of government that's way worse. I won't make you guess, it's the legislative branch. They are the dysfunctional winners. Congratulations to the mostly white guys. Because of a widening population gap between bigger states with more cities and much less dense rural areas, we've been seeing a troubling imbalance in representation. As the New York Times pointed out, there are 62 senators who represent the same number of people as 6 other senators. The anthropomorphic flat tire that is Mitch McConnell, for example, holds an infuriating amount of power despite being elected by a state with half the population of New York City. If you ignore political parties, the majority of the Senate represent only 18% of the population. If you don't ignore parties, Republicans represent just 44% of the country, while still holding the majority in Senate. So if you're wondering why, statistically speaking, most of you watching this are in a perpetual state of white-knuckle rage, that's because the people making decisions don't actually represent most of you. It's a broken system that's only going to get worse. That's why it's important to try to at least make our congressional elections functional, lest we burn it all down and start over. Something that isn't the worst idea. But probably the subject of another video a year from now when I'm wearing body armor and am somehow more disheveled. So yeah, let's stick the Electoral College on the back burner and focus on a bigger problem concerning Congress, and that thing is gerrymandering, aka the redrawing of district borders in order to gain a political advantage in an area. It's similar to the issues with the Electoral College in that it's partitioning the majority into smaller chunks where they aren't the majority anymore. This is done through either packing, which is when a large group of like-minded voters are crammed into one district where their collective vote is given a smaller representation within the state, or cracking, which is when that large group is spread across several districts thinly enough to make them the minority in each individual chunk. While partisan-based gerrymandering is somehow illegal, it has been getting very out of control in certain battleground states. People in Ohio, for example, can walk into their backyards and suddenly be in another district. When a congresswoman called Governor John Kasich's office to complain, they laughed at her and hung up, like literal villains. This is done by both Democrats and Republicans, and is currently the subject of several court battles that will make their way to the Supreme Court. As of this video's release, they are either still being decided or currently being appealed. And while that sounds like a good step toward progress, it's actually not that thing. Because there's a chance that the Supreme Court could set a precedent that would make gerrymandering worse. Not to mention they historically haven't been able to solve or really address the issue at all. Which is why we go back to the problem of congressional representation and the people who are able to fix it. If you haven't figured it out yet, they happen to be the people we elect through gerrymandering. Otherwise known as the people who benefit the most from not fixing gerrymandering. Right now that's Republicans. Later it'll be Democrats. Meanwhile, the only people saying it's a problem are the people who aren't in charge. It's almost like we created a system where the people in power hold the most control over how power is given. Luckily, as the saying goes, power never corrupts ever. So until the cycle ends, we're going to continue taking chunks of land and labeling them as blue or red, and the minority group in those chunks will continue to be forced to either accept it or leave. A Democrat in rural Texas has no say, nor does a Republican in liberal New York. It makes sense that voter turnout is especially lower in non-battleground states and will probably keep getting worse. Voting for the minority party in one of these safe states is like being a child buying plastic food with play money. It's a meaningless gesture that breeds only the darkest of scorn in the toddler's heart that they will never forget and eventually rise up against you, which is why we keep them in cages, probably. So once we successfully beg our congresspeople to maybe do a thing about the thing, how can we easily fix gerrymandering? Remember, we're talking about getting politicians to agree on changing something. So forget about big, useful acts of progress, lest we, do that burning it all down thing I mentioned. Well, for starters, instead of letting the politicians do it, we can create an independent organization in charge of drawing district lines, one that is, in theory, nonpartisan. It's better than nothing, but the obvious problem is that these would still be human beings, humans who enjoy money. But you know who doesn't enjoy money? Some kind of robot, a computing robot to specify, one that uses math. Math that could at least regulate gerrymandering with something called the efficiency gap, which is basically a numerical score given to a state that would rate how unfairly wasted the votes were in any given election. For example, if a party had a 20% efficiency gap in a certain area, that means they won 20% more seats than they should have based on what proportion of supporters they had. If we agreed on using this model, lawmakers could actually set a hard number that states couldn't cross. The problem is that this is all still being decided by the Supreme Court, an institution that just last year referred to statistical evidence of the effects of gerrymandering as, quote, sociological gobbledygook, because our country is being run by the kids who farted on you in high school. I'm sorry, boofed. Clearly that's the word for that. Anywho, we're not going to get anywhere until we, as a nation, perhaps recognize that there are certain experts needed for certain tasks, and just hire and trust mathematicians and programmers to create a working system that draws district lines for us. This is something that smart people have been doing on their own for smart people fun. And if anyone tries to tell you that you need real humans to make these decisions, keep in mind that politicians are already using algorithms for partisan gerrymandering. Computers are already drawing the unfair lines, so it stands to reason that we can probably use those same computers to draw fair lines. Like if you took a computer and you put basic information like zip codes and population numbers while omitting data like racial demographics and party affiliations, that computer could draw clear district lines based on nothing but the geography. Focusing on zip codes doesn't just make complete sense, but it would make it far less confusing for people to figure out who represented them. And if the robots rise up and systematically wipe out humanity, well, that would also solve gerrymandering. Well, with all the aforementioned burning it down and starting over stuff. But even that could still run into problems. For example, certain districts are gerrymandered in order to preserve representation for minority voters, which is one of the few good reasons to do it. We wouldn't want to just draw a grid on a map because that's not how most communities exist. And it's important to keep communities together, at least to better fight the murderous robots. But there's another way we can do that, and also make gerrymandering far less of a problem. It's going to take a second to explain, so bear with me. Now, you've probably seen this graphic demonstrating the problem with gerrymandering. In it, there are 50 squares, 60% blue, 40% red. And if you were to draw 5 districts from that, you can completely change the outcome of an election depending on where you put the lines. But what if we just didn't draw any lines? What if we made our districts larger? Then, instead of having one person representing that new district, we actually had 5 different people representing them. This is called a multi-member district, and it's already being used in states like Arizona, New Jersey, South Dakota, and Washington. The way it works is that when it comes time for elections, there are a certain number of seats per district to be filled. In my example, that's 5 seats. Each party would then nominate that many people to fill those seats. Citizens would either elect their preferred party as a whole, or one specific person they would want to represent them. Each seat is then given based on the percentage of the vote. So going back to that fake district, which I'm going to call Cody's County. Cody's County. If there were 5 seats available, and 60% of voters went with blue, then they would claim 3 of those seats. The other 2 would go to red. So while blue would have the majority in that district, everyone would be represented in proportion to how they voted. And since it's a mix of red and blue politicians representing that district, they would all be more inclined to get along with each other. They would all have to work in the same office, share the same printer, and poop in the same toilet. And best of all, it's really hard to gerrymander when the districts are much larger and instead have multiple seats. There are no lines to draw, and so the only way to skew an election is to have better candidates. They would have to try and junk. Also, if every election is proportional and not winner take all, well, then that would give third parties an actual chance. And finally, places like New York City and rural America would give voice to the minority party in that area. They would have a reason to actually vote. When the New York Times used a program to redistrict the very blue-leaning state of Massachusetts with this model, they found that making larger and multi-member districts would actually give Republicans a fair representation. The same went for Democrats in the state of Texas. If done right, this would barely affect the number of House representatives we have, since we're getting rid of districts but adding multiple members to the larger ones. Then there's a second step to this, which is to completely change how we vote for these people. And that is to use a ranked choice system. The way this works is that instead of voting for a single candidate, we'd all get to rank the candidates in order of who we'd most want to win. The number one choices would be tallied, and if no one has received a big enough percentage, the least popular candidate would be eliminated from the pool. But those voters wouldn't be discounted, and instead their second choice would be added to the final tally of the other candidates, and so on, and so forth. And while that would work really well for choosing your representatives and your senators, you know what would be really nifty for? Electing a goddamn president. If, for example, in the 2016 election, you wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders, but you also didn't want your vote to hurt Hillary Clinton's chances if Bernie didn't win, then you could put her as your second choice. It would completely eliminate the idea that third-party candidates ruin the election, and would in fact encourage people to vote for them, and perhaps create even more parties running at once. Much like multi-member districts making gerrymandering moot, this new system might make us forget about all of the problems of the Electoral College, of which there are at least several. It's a far easier solution than switching to a popular voting system. So, yeah, we have some options. Options that would probably solve some very big problems, while not interfering too much with the system we already have in place. Options that would help both political parties and reinvigorate voters, so we probably won't be seeing them anytime soon. Not without, burning something, burning it down. Metaphorically? Also, and this is going to hurt your brain, but had we used ranked choice in the 2000 election, there's a chance that Al Gore would have won. We could have had Al Gore as president. This guy would have solved that climate change, this guy. Wait, then who would have gotten the Oscar? Bush? Would Bush have gotten an Oscar for like a documentary on his dogs? The dog-umentary? It'd be like a whole new genre, invented all thanks to me, Cody. You're welcome, Hollywood. That's what this was about. Hollywood, not the voting stuff. It was about the voting stuff. Scratch that. Yeah! Thanks for watching the end of the video. Make sure to like and subscribe, and check out our podcast, Even More News. Support us on patreon.com/somemorenews. Yeah!